episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another fascinating guest who is helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us. We have the honor today of being joined by Dr. Don Torday, who is investigator at the Lundquist Institute of Biomedical Intervention, professor of Pediatrics and Obstetrics and Gynecology, and on the faculty of Evolutionary Medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and director of the Perinatal Research Training Program, the Guenther Laboratory for Cell Molecular Biology, and faculty in the Division of Neonatology at the Harbor-UCLA Medical Center. Dr. Torday studies the cellular and molecular development of the lung and other visceral organs, using such established principles of cell-cell communication as the basis for determining the patterns of physiological development. And his laboratory was the first to determine the complete repertoire of lung alveolar morphogenesis. And in this highly regulated structure, they were offered the opportunity to trace the evolution of the lung from its unicellular origins forward, both developmentally and phylogenetically. And the lung is an algorithm for understanding the evolution of physiological properties in many other organs, including the kidney, skin, liver, gut, central nervous system. And this basic knowledge is crucial in the matters of how and why physiological evolution is useful in the effective diagnosis and treatment of disease, which we'll be getting into. Dr. Torday received his undergraduate degree in biology and English from Boston University, his master's and Ph.D. in experimental medicine from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, did postdoc fellowship in reproductive endocrinology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Dr. Torday's research has led to the publication of more than 150 peer-reviewed articles, 350 abstracts. Most recently, he has gained an interest in the evolutionary aspects of comparative physiology and development, leading to a publication of 12 peer-reviewed articles in cellular origins of vertebrate physiology, which culminated in the book Evolutionary Biology, Cell-Cell Communication and Complex Disease. He is also the co-author and co-editor on several volumes, including Evolution, The Logic of Biology, Evidence-Based Evolutionary Medicine, Morphogenesis, Environmental Stress and Reverse Evolution, and most recently, The Singularity of Nature, Convergence of Biology, Chemistry, and Physics. Dr. John Torday, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. It's a fascinating domain that you're involved in. To start off, I just want to hand you the floor for a couple minutes. If you could just introduce yourself, a little bit about who you are and a bit of your background, sort of where you grew up, how you got interested in medicine, experimental medicine, and a little bit of your interest in sort of this fascinating domain of evolutionary biology and physiology. I think that's a great way to start things off.
Sure, my pleasure. So I was born at the Semmelweis Hospital in Budapest, Hungary, where Semmelweis taught the physicians to wash their hands, thankfully. And we all wash our hands now in this age of COVID. I grew up in New York. So in terms of my motivation, I'm the child of Holocaust survivors, and I have spent my career trying to fill in the gap of ignorance as best I can, because I attribute the Holocaust to ignorance. And I continue to do so. I spent 50 years in the laboratory trying to understand lung development, because it's the rate limiting step between the delivery room and life writ large, and particularly for premature infants. I'm trained formally as an endocrinologist, and it had been discovered that a simple molecule, cortisol, could actually effectively accelerate lung development. And so we all know this, or many of us know the story of the Kennedy baby who died in 1962 of hyaline membrane disease. That disease essentially no longer exists through the use of cortisol and exogenous lung surfactant, because the lung is not mature at the time of birth. And so these babies were dying, virtually all of them would die at less than 36 weeks gestation, and now they all survive. So that was a lesson for me in terms of the possibility of humankind to actually make a major inroad in a human disease right at the beginnings, at the transition from one generation to the next, which to my mind was enormous. And I spent my career trying to understand how that mechanism worked in order to understand it, first of all, and understand what its significance, and perhaps to make further inroads into diagnosis and treatment. I actually created a laboratory at Brigham and Women's Hospital for the measurement of lung surfactant in amniotic fluid, which basically allowed for a Ph.D. to last at Harvard Medical School for more than the gong show 2 years that most people spend there. I was there for 15 years. But my point being that I always was perplexed by the fact that, yes, I thought I had discovered yet another physiologic principle and thought that that would create a narrative. And I always found myself chasing my own tail. It's like Ouroboros, that snake that catches its own tail, or even a dog catching its own tail. Until about 20 years ago now, I wrote a review article on what we knew about the cellular molecular basis for an alveolus, which the alveolus, basically the lung, is what allowed fish to transition onto land and become terrestrial organisms. And it turned out that there are some very fundamental gene duplications that occurred in that transition. All of them they're all hormone receptors, which is significant. But my point being that I realized that there actually was a narrative. And the way that I came to that realization was I looked at this schematic I had created, which was the cover of Pediatric Research that month. And I thought to myself, those two germ cells, the endodermal and mesodermal cells that interact to form 40 different cell types in the lung, that was either chance or there's some underlying principle or principles involved. And when I did the math, it would have taken longer than the existence of the universe for that to happen by chance. So the default mode was there must be some underlying set of principles. And so I began to reverse engineer through cell-cell communications, which we had discovered were the mediators of this hormonal effect on lung development, and every other tissue and organ in the body worked that all the way back to the unicellular state. And at every juncture, it was the relationship between lipids, which come from pulsars in the cosmos, and oxygen. That's what it's all about. And so it's a very simple algorithm, actually. And in fact, we just complicate the story. You know, when Darwin's tangled bank is really just observational and you know, the relationship between adults and reproductive strategy, that's just bean counting. That's not really what it's all about. Right. The underlying basis for evolution is actually internal selection. It's the relationship of stresses physiologically that cause a failure of homeostasis, and then the cells have to self-author to reestablish homeostasis. That's what evolution actually is. So that was a very long and hard lesson to learn, 50 years of duration. And only recently, because I've been discussing this issue with people I know who are cyberneticists, have I realized that what I actually was dealing with, in a sense, is cybernetics. I've been able to transition from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics as the basis for biology, which then answers the question as to why it is that everyone thinks that quantum mechanics is the basis of all of existence. And now biology, like the atom, is both deterministic and probabilistic. And I've concluded now that what we're really dealing with is we are in a dialogue with the cosmos. It's a cybernetic relationship all the way down. You know, it used to be turtles all the way down. Now that's what it actually is. And so the reason I think it's important is because now biology, like chemistry and physics, is a hard science. It is descriptive. That's critically important. Predominantly because medicine, the biology is the basic science of medicine. But beyond that, I think we can now move forward if only we were to realize the first principles of physiology, which I published a paper on, which had never been claimed before. Or for that matter, a central theory of biology. How we became warm-blooded actually teaches us the central theory of biology. My point being that we're just burdened with dogma in biology, when in fact there is a way to move forward to understand these principles, these phenomena in biology mechanistically and not just descriptively. So I guess that's pretty much it for me.
No, I appreciate that introduction, and it feeds very nicely into sort of where I was going with the discussion flow here, because you know, as you and I chatted offline, and you mentioned this well called the failure, as you said, to connect the dots between physics and biology. And you know, I've always found the fascinating thing about the area that you've been focused on for a couple decades now in terms of morphogenesis, this biology of form, of structure, of size, of shape, of polarity. If you and I go back 100 years, we took a time machine back to some biology lab, the language surrounding all this stuff back then, we didn't know about genes or DNA or anything of that nature. Everything was described in terms of physics, fields and forces and waves, the whole principle of morphogenetic fields from the 1920s. And now here we are in 2021, and we're realizing, hey, it's not all about the genes. There's nothing in these genes anywhere that say, hey, a lung should look like this and be a such and such size and be located here and not down here and so forth. Talk a little bit about this disconnection as you saw it evolving, as you went through this path, especially in your work on the lung. How did what happened in the sense as you were doing this work? Really, you realize, wow, we've really forgotten a lot about what came before in understanding complexity of form.
Well, I think there's a huge systematic error that we've made in being overly reductionist in biology. Once you transit the cell membrane, you're not talking about biology anymore.
Yep.
So if David Bohm is a favorite of mine. Bohm was a physicist who trained with Einstein, and his central thesis was that there's the implicate order, which is basically what we think of as the pure form of reality. And then we live in the explicate order, that is, we see things through our evolved senses. And so we process everything based upon, we're all survivors. And how have we done that? It's through the exploitation of our senses in order to survive. But that filters out reality, the true nature, of what the cosmos is really all about. And so, and I've only realized over the last few months that there's a very important principle involved there, because the way that I understand the origins of life is, I mentioned earlier, lipids. Lipids, when they're immersed in water, they form these primitive cells spontaneously. Yep. And furthermore, lipids float. And all I could picture was, well, okay, so they're floating on the surface of this primordial ocean that was formed by these asteroids that pelted the surface of the Earth about 100 million years after the formation of the Earth. And, you have the sun shining on these lipids, and they deform, they liquefy. That's what they do. But when the sun goes down and things get cold, they reform. They have molecular memory. These micelles have molecular memory. It's called hysteresis. And then if you picture the leaching of calcium out of the basalt, because the oceans got more and more acidic due to formation of carbon dioxide by plants, dissolving in water, et cetera, et cetera. But as these primitive cells expanded by day and contracted by night, they trapped calcium within them. And those micelles that were able to form calcium channels survived. They are our ancestors. So the ability to form a calcium flux is the basis for all of vertebrate life, for sure, and most of life. And the reason that I think that I only recently found this paper that by Brian Spooner, a well-known embryologist, showing that without gravity, you do not form those micelles. I did experiments, as have others, showing that gravity is necessary for for conducting a calcium wave and also for reproduction. So there's this intimate relationship between gravity as one of the laws of nature and biology. And furthermore, so that's where I got into the quantum mechanical aspect, because one of Einstein's field theories was when gravity impinges on a curved surface, like those micelles, and I understand that he was talking about grand scale, celestial kinds of things, but it works on the small scale too, because if you deprive those micelles, or even the experiments I've done with lung and bone cells, if you deprive them of gravity, they become comatose. They become like zombies. They don't know that they're a cell anymore. Okay, so the impinging of gravity on those curved structures generates energy, and that energy was necessary for what Schrodinger referred to as negentropy. Yep. That is the secret in the sauce. That is the basis of life, the ability to maintain a negative entropic state. Mm-hmm. Secret. Okay. So But that brings you down to the quantum level. So that's where I started to think about the implications of quantum mechanics as the basis for life, because quantum entanglement allows for particles that entered those primitive cells to be related to one another in reference to the non-local principle. What's happening within the micelle is also happening in the cosmos. That's the bow plan for life. And then you have Lynn Margulis was a professor of mine. She taught us about symbiogenesis, but that's after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
The system already knows that there is a bow plan, that there is a set of principles involved in the formation of life, that we and the big knock against that idea of transition from quantum mechanics to Newtonian mechanics is decoherence. But the reason that the cells do cohere is because of the cell signaling mechanisms. That's what allows for that bridging from the quantum to the Newtonian mechanical, and beyond to what we think of as normal or classical physiology. But the point is that there is an underlying set of principles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we understood those better, and if we could measure them, we could actually practice predictive biology and medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, eliminate a lot of the pain and suffering that people have to go through in order to become a patient, so where they're recognized by the medical system. Because if you use evolutionary principles, other than infection and being hit by a truck, every other chronic disease is referred to as a simplification disease. It's not a simplification. It's a reversion to an earlier state of homeostatic control evolutionarily. And if you were to recognize that, you could devise techniques in imaging that would recognize basically the loss of constraint of free energy. That's what it's all about. And therefore, you could identify a patient before they were a patient, and you could intervene and you could eliminate the disease. That would be huge. And it's doable. There's no question in my mind that it's doable. You probably understand this better than I do, Ira, but I'm convinced that it's that is what preventive medicine actually is. It's not diet and exercise.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that one.
And you interviewed Len Hayflick. He's an idol in biomedical research, and I don't agree with him. I think that death is not a certainty. Death is basically because we skew the life cycle towards the reproductive strategy, and then the energetics fail and the cell signaling fails. But there are ways that you can make it. Once you understand the mechanism, there are clearly ways that can be palliated minimally and even eliminated.
Yeah.
Theoretically, in trying to mathematically express what I do or the way I think. One of the people that I tried to collaborate with who would mathematically express the periodic table of elements, he kept asking me for more data. And in order to do that, I basically had to find a final common denominator for all of life, basically. And so interestingly, the target of rapamycin gene is stuck on the cytoskeleton of the cell. And the target of rapamycin gene funnels every property of the cell through it. It's the master gene. So, for example, you could manipulate the target of rapamycin gene in a way where it wouldn't shut off, or that sort of thing. So I think it's totally doable. It's just that we think in terms of, okay, so here's the secret, the message, and that is looking in hindsight, which is the way we've looked at biology since the get-go, Linnaeus and binomial nomenclature, is in hindsight. Everything looks like a binary in hindsight. However, looked at in the forward direction, there are multiple options. And it's a question of which of those options was chosen. So it's a different paradigm. We need a paradigm shift. So.
And continuing along that, in your book, Morphogenesis, Environmental Stress and Reverse Evolution, you have this chapter 14, Chronic Disease as Reverse Evolution. You talk about the first principles that you were mentioning before, negentropy, chemiosmosis, and homeostasis, and then obviously the loss of that. And you give many examples in terms of things from emphysema, osteoporosis, brain pathologies, and so forth. Talk about a little bit of that, because we talk about sort of in the field of cancer, right, de-differentiation dynamics that occur and how similar cancer cells become to stem cells and so forth. Talk about some of the things that you see, as someone that is in the world of physiology, in terms of these sort of first steps of reverse evolutionary occurring. And then also you mentioned this principle of terminal addition, which I think I'd like you to take a few minutes to talk about. I mean, I know it has one context, but in the context of reverse evolution, talk about terminal addition for a couple minutes as well.
Sure. Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, I mean, I spent my career in neonatology, which is pediatrics in the first 30 days of life, and it basically is preterm infants. And so the whole enterprise of neonatology is to try and match the phenotype of the newborn with its genetics, because it's born too early. Mm-hmm. And that's another whole issue that I could discuss. But yeah, so that's the optic, the lens that I've seen the process of life through, in terms of a failed mission to basically reach a homeostatic set point. And then, all bets are off once you're out of the womb, and you gotta, it's showtime, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about terminal addition, because somebody, a PhD student in Australia that I mentor, is interested in, oddly enough, in people who do strange things, self-mutilate. It's a whole pathology.
Sure.
And the subject that came up in our discussion was phantom limb syndrome.
Sure.
And she says to me, why would that make any sense? Because it is not intuitively obvious that should be some sort of an advantage, some sort of an adaptive strategy. And then I said to her, well, but think of it this way. I mean, if it's all about these cellular communications, which have evolved over the history of the organism, if you lose a limb, everything upstream of that, if you don't have phantom limb, if you don't still have the end organ response in a sort of fashion as a history of the organism, everything upstream of that is going to atrophy. That's not advantageous. So that's, to my mind, and furthermore, it doesn't make any sense to stick new stuff on in the middle of a progression or at the beginning, because that is undermining the evolutionary strategy. Build upon the first principles, and then just keep on doing the same thing depending upon the conditions that you're confronting. So, for me, the merging of evolution and cell signaling in that respect answered a question which otherwise would have been totally enigmatic. So I don't know if that's where you wanted me to go, but that's the take home for me.
Yeah, no, I was. Can you also, while we're at, can you also talk about sort of when you talk about the term reverse evolution, you're not necessarily talking about having a completely differentiated organism that is going back to that neonatal stage, but you're talking about sort of the loss of, once again coming to these morphogenetic concepts that you've been involved in, the loss of the ability to maintain, in sense, that homeostasis. In fact, they were maintaining something here that is a brain, that is a heart, that is a kidney. I was going to say just a little bit more about the reverse evolution principle that you talk about in that chapter.
So I should have said earlier, or very early on, everything I say is based upon empirical evidence. I don't make stuff up.
Sure.
And so I became engaged with a French anthropologist, sort of polymath, who has this collection of ammonites.
Sure.
All good. And he has convinced himself. So when he has this ammonite collection, he can show that there are stages in ammonite. So an ammonite is like this chambered nautilus kind of organism. And he has these shells, and he can show that by carbon dating, he knows what the age of that ammonite is. And sometimes you see a reversion to an earlier phase of the ammonites evolution, if you will.
Yep.
And so he had a whole host of invertebrate biologists that he plays with, who contributed to that book. Bill Miller, a retired radiologist, and I contributed 2 chapters based upon this idea that chronic disease is actually a reversal of the evolutionary strategy in order to maintain the organism until it can pass its genes on. That's basically what we're talking about. It's a stopgap measure. But more importantly, perhaps, There are biologic models, one of which is slime molds,
Yep.
which will be either free swimming or colonial, depending upon the amount of nutrition in the environment.
Yep.
So we know that they can switch from one form to another. And then there's Turritopsis dohrnii, which is a jellyfish, which is thought to be immortal. Well, it's not. It's really just adapting to a stressful condition in order to, and again, in all these circumstances, it's all about epigenetic inheritance. It's the ability to interface with the environment and determine whether there are any novel changes in the environment in order to then inform the organism and furthermore its progeny through the germ cells, egg and sperm, that there's something coming that you've got to know about in order to pre-tune yourself to adapt. That's the strategy of Lamarckian inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
We study in my laboratory with regard to childhood asthma. Okay, but my point being, Hayflick was complaining about the fact that people who talk about aging, they default to chronic diseases, metabolic syndrome, for example. Well, the reason for that is if humans, when they're born small for gestational age because of food deprivation, they actually go through the life cycle more rapidly, and I won't go through the details of that, but there are endocrine mechanisms that accelerate the process of puberty through the adrenal function of the adrenal gland.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're doing is they're trying to get to the next duty station, the next environment that is not food is food sufficient. That's what they're doing. So metabolic syndrome is really not disease. It's a strategy for trying to optimize the ability of the species to survive. The metabolic syndrome, the diabetes, the obesity, not to trivialize them, but those are really epiphenomena. We're not really understanding the central principle,
Mm-hmm.
which is holistically maintaining homeostasis throughout the organism. That's what that health message really is. And so I think it's unfortunate that we don't recognize the disease as being a maladaptive response or an adaptive response, depending on how you look at it. But that's why I think that the way that I'm addressing what biology actually is immensely beneficial in terms of understanding causal relationships. We've got it backwards, and all that's doing is generating more and more drugs. And drugs treating the side effects of drugs because we don't understand, the underlying principles. Okay, and you know that as well as I do, and we all recognize it, but we think that that's all we've got. I was a member of the Integrative and Comparative Biology Society for a decade and gave a couple of symposia, and did not realize until I went to a breakout session in one of those national meetings where they talked about creationism versus Darwinism. They think it's a binary, that there is no other option. That's a huge mistake. And I think it's a failure of imagination, really, and trying to understand what the data are telling us. But then again, I mean, I've spent 50 years as a funded investigator, and I've had the luxury, I guess, of being able to then step back and really think about what it is I've been doing. Yeah. So,
continuing along that,
yeah.
we've done several shows. And thank you for bringing up slime molds, because this is one of the categories that we get into in terms of what we're learning nowadays in terms of these and you have a recent paper, cellular sonomic measurements of cognition-based evolution, where you talk about these tissue, what you refer to as tissue ecologies, and we mentioned some of this as when we talk about some of these lower life forms or organisms that don't have brains or they don't have nervous systems, yet as a group, that slime mold, for instance, demonstrates sensing and valence and learning and anticipation and all sorts of stuff that we as complex organisms experience. And you talk about in this one paper this evolution, biology being reframed as this continuous process of self-referential cellular measurements all along the way at all different levels. So starting sort of with these less complex organisms, but what we're learning nowadays, take us on a little bit of your into your writings about consciousness and memory and things of this nature, because I think there's some very fascinating connections here.
Well, I think that started primarily with David Chalmers' hard question. Why is it when you whack your thumb with a hammer, you see red? I think that essentially that cellular communication mechanism, which basically starts in the zygote, the fertilized egg, actually go from fertilized egg to fertilized egg. That's the life cycle, not adult to adult. We think of life as being adult to adult, but that's because we think of ourselves as material. We are actually energy flows. Okay, that's Alfred North Whitehead, and I'm not Looney Tunes. I can explain that. Okay, so there's a given set of progression from the zygote to the newborn that has to be followed, pretty much, with a little bit of wiggle in the system, male or female or race or whatever, but basically it's the same pattern, and it's all mediated by these soluble growth factors and their receptors. And so I am of the opinion that actually is what consciousness is. It's the awareness of our history. So that, for example, when you whack your thumb with a hammer, you see red because you're reflecting back upon that stage in your evolution when you bled. And there's also pain. And it's subconscious or it's unconscious, but it becomes to the fore because of that stress. So one of the reasons I started thinking this way was I realized that I could superimpose phylogeny, speciation, on ontogeny, development, because they're both based upon the same set of cellular molecular mechanisms on different time scales, yes, but it's the same process. That's actually what the quantum physicists call a wave collapse. So you have this collapse of the calcium flows into one common calcium flow. And that flow refers all the way back to the singularity that existed before the Big Bang, and what the unicell was formed in reference to that singularity. So basically what I see in my mind's eye when I think in those terms, we have this vector, this carrier wave, starting with the Big Bang, and to this moment, each step in that progression is within us. It's in our DNA. It's, we talk about it's in our DNA. It's actually in the cells, in the cell membranes of every organ, every cell in our body. And so there is memory. I talked about that earlier. Yep. That memory is essential for evolution, but memory is not DNA. Classically, what you see evolutionarily is first there's some condition, some existential condition, which the organism confronts and uses what it has already got within its toolkit to cope in an ad hoc way, but then over time, evolutionarily, it becomes genetic. And so DNA is really the genetic form of the evolution of memory, cellular memory. And so near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, the runner's high, those are all examples of that wave collapse. I actually experienced it a number of years ago when I lived in Los Angeles, and I was in a high-speed rollover accident with my wife. And I was driving, and I pictured myself watching this whole thing roll out on this high-speed freeway, me sitting in the backseat watching it like I was watching a video. And everything was in shades of gray. There was no noise. And I was totally at ease, just waiting to die. So for that reason, I do think that the neuroendocrine hormones like endorphins, which are responsible for the runner's high, or oxytocin, which allows for milk letdown and uterine contraction, but also is necessary for body temperature. It's the genetic way that the body controls temperature, for example. When those neuroendocrine hormones are turned on maximally, you enter into that carrier wave, or you closely approximate that carrier wave. That is our evolution. And I don't mean to sound like a nut, but I do think that there's a certain consistency in that, in terms of this continuum, that actually makes far more sense to me now in retrospect because of Occam's razor. The energy flows are far more simple and direct than all of those phenotypic forms that we dwell on as biologists. When in fact, one of the papers that I published was thinking, so the phenotype is usually thought of as that collection of traits that we have, height, weight, you name it. It's not that. It's agency. It's how the organism is able to adapt in a way which is as close as it can possibly get to reducing, biology is all about reducing noise and increasing signal. That's what we do. We're trying to detect the novelty in the environment at very low levels of detection. But they're critical because they're what keeps us from becoming extinct. Okay. There are certainly there are big signals like, that meteorite that hit the Yucatan, okay, or, glaciation, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about normal geologic, geochemical kinds of transitions that are key to these micro adaptations that essentially add up to what we think of as evolution. So yeah, so I think, I'm a big fan of Occam and parsimony, and I do think that energy, and the primary reason I started thinking about it that way is because those cellular mechanisms, those cell signaling mechanisms from the zygote to the newborn and beyond in physiology and pathophysiology, they're all energy transfers, because what happens is you have a growth factor that tickles a receptor from one cell type that goes and tickles this receptor on another cell type. And by the way, I was trained by Jack Gorski, who discovered the estrogen receptor. So I go back a long ways. But what happens is that process stimulates high energy phosphates, cyclic AMP, inositol phosphates, and they're actually what trigger the next step, either growth, differentiation, or growth of that target cell. It's all energy transfers. It's not so that we're focused on the wrong thing. We're focused on stuff we can see and we can feel and we can measure. When in fact, once we finally realize the premise, it's not that at all. It's all about energy, starting with, and you can start with solar energy, sure. I talked about the deformation of those micelles, but then it becomes, organic, in ways which transcend the solar and become other forms of energy that are derivative of that. And that's where it gets complicated in a sense, but in reality, it's one continuous process, one generation to the next. How do we get to the next generation, and how do we do it efficiently? And efficiency is very important because, nature abhors a vacuum, but you can't fill it with any old thing because that's not going to work. You've got to be nimble. That's why efficiency is important, and that's an important underpinning of what I'm talking about. So one thing I learned, recently was in that sense of that asymmetry of the life cycle, and how you have energy being shifted towards the reproductive strategy, and then that's why things poop out at the end of life. Even a unicellular organism, we know now that amoeba, they don't divide symmetrically. And you wonder why that is, and I think it's because everything after the Big Bang was an asymmetry. Chemistry and physics resolved that problem through reactions that we all and interactions we all recognize as the laws of nature. And in fact, that equal sign in that balanced equation is homeostasis. Homeostasis is the equal and opposite reaction to the Big Bang. In biology, it's not stasis, that's death. It's the ability to remain in a viable state in that white water condition that we're all exist in perpetuity. That's the name of the game, is how do you keep, in sync with that ever changing environment. Yeah, so I think that's why the asymmetry is important. And I'm sorry, and I think I mentioned that. No, I didn't. So that's the key to the kind of thing I'm talking about is we began as an inhomogeneity, as an ambiguity. I wrote a paper about that. Ambiguity in the sense of this negative entropy within the cell, positive entropy in the environment. In the interim, from our inception, we made up all these, they call Bubba-meisters in Yiddish, okay, these stories, which made us feel okay about ourselves, like the Garden of Eden, and and on and on and on. And we continue to tell ourselves stories to this day, but it's not panning out anymore because they're false narratives. We have to understand the true narrative in order to be able to maximize what resources we have with 7 billion people, and a population explosion. We cannot afford to fail again, in my opinion, in this. So what are we going to do the day after COVID? That's the question I keep asking. Okay, so I don't need to sound preachy, but I do think it's important.
No, it's very important, and you know, you said a couple times you don't mean to sound like a nut, but you don't sound like a nut. You're basically you're saying what I've actually hear a lot of people saying nowadays that have been in a domain like you have, and you're realizing, hey, there's a lot more happening here. I need to study it, but yet we have this, you know, huge narrative in the existing system that just likes reductionism and likes simple targets and all this bit. We've gone from as small as the quantum to as large as the cosmos in this discussion, all of which, you know, trickle down and trickle up to this integrated system. I guess, you know, my question always is, and I'll throw it to you, and you can run with it any way you want. If, you know, the skies open up tomorrow and, you know, a quadrillion dollars falls out into your pocket, what's the 2021 biomedical, biophysical, whatever you want to call it, research system that Dr. John Torday would like to develop based on these principles? And what will it look like? It's not going to be drugs in the traditional sense. What do you think about it? You know, obviously you spend so much time. Now you have another 50 years to build the next thing. What are you building?
So there are two ideas. Well, it's actually one idea. I'm convinced that we are naked apes. We all sort of acknowledge that, but we're actually juvenile naked apes. And the reason we're juvenile is because there was huge selection pressure on our central nervous system so that our heads and contents kept getting larger and larger until we could not fit through the birth canal anymore. And so we're now born, unlike every other naked ape, great ape, I'm sorry, with only about 25% of the total brain volume of an adult. We spend 20 to 30 years maturing. That's unheard of in the animal kingdom, other than us. And it explains why our behaviors are the way they are. Risk-taking, narcissism, instant gratification, and on and on and on and on. And society and civilization has evolved in order to accommodate that. And there's a reason for that. It's called niche construction. So niche construction is this, you know, like beaver build dams and humans build city states and, you know, nation states. And okay, it's the same. So, and the basis for niche construction is the unicell was the first niche construction. It internalized the ecology. And so this is Boehm's idea of enfolding and unfolding. Yep. Boehm already recognized that. He just didn't know why that was. Okay, so I think it's I think the statement is correct based upon physical and chemical and biological principles. But the point I'm trying to make is we don't recognize the fact that we are perpetual juveniles, other than, you know, institutions of government and law and, you know, on and on. But they're all ad hoc. They're not really recognizing that our strengths are also our weaknesses. And so when you ask me, what would I do with that kind of money? I would try to develop institutional systems that would mitigate against the bad stuff, if you will, the bad behaviors, and maximize the good behaviors. And in turn, that would have an ongoing effect. I mean, I think of that as being, you know, how religious institutions work. They basically encourage the good behavior and discourage the bad behavior. Okay, but it's all, you know, it's based upon punitive actions as opposed to knowing our shortcomings and recognizing them. I think we're the only organism that knows that we know. And because we know we're mortal, it scares the bejesus out of us. And that's why we behave the way we do. That's the bottom line. And so if we can intervene in effective ways to basically maximize our good traits and minimize the bad stuff in an epistemological way, which is beneficial to mankind, that's what I think we need to do. I think you were asking about the science. I think the science would be, you know, to essentially mitigate against disease, because disease is a huge, it's friction. It causes us to deviate from that vector that I described earlier. Mm-hmm. And the further we deviate from that vector, the more friction there is, the more difficult life is. And then it becomes, instead of problem solving, which we're really good at, it becomes flight or flight. And that's the key, is to minimize the fight or flight reaction. But we're going through it now.
Yeah.
This is how, in my opinion, I don't mean to introduce politics. Our previous president, he ruled by fear. That's horrendous. It's so counter to the mission of this country in terms of creativity and productivity. As a result, the relationship between the patent office, the central government, and universities. It's what I've created a career based upon. So I don't know if that's where you wanted me to go, but I do think that there is a central, there's a way of of making things work to our favor and not this pull apart program where you have somebody, like the Bill Gateses of this world or Ben Franklin's or whatever, who they are very close, if not on top of that vector. They understand principles and they create value. And then you get the rest of us who are looking for shiny stuff, and we just glom on to this process. We weigh it down, and all of a sudden it's like this boom or bust, cycle. We cannot afford that any longer as a species, in my opinion. So, yeah.
Absolutely. John, anything you have coming up? Any talks you're going to be giving? Stuff that you in the coming month? I mean, obviously we're all hunkered down here still, but hopefully we're coming out of this with the vaccine now. But anything you have coming up you might want to mention that you can talk about over the next year?
So I
Zoom
with people at the University of Liverpool who perseverate over, they're educators, and so they're trying to understand or figure out how to make education at the university level more consonant with millennials who believe in nothing. I think that's problematic. I actually gave a lecture at the Claremont College in LA before I left. That's where Alfred North Whitehead created his Process Institute. And Whitehead was his philosophy was it's really all energy, and occasionally energy coalesces as matter, but that's a side effect. At any rate, so when I gave that lecture, it's the only time in my career I ever got a standing ovation, because they realized that I understood from my scientific perspective what Whitehead was trying to say in a philosophical sense. But to answer your question, so I'm supposed to, they have some high level forum there where I'm supposed to defend, or not so much defend, but talk about the future of the scientific PhD versus someone talking about in the humanities about the humanistic, humanities-based PhD. And what I've been talking about, I think, is so Alfred C.P. Snow talked about the two cultures. Back in 1959, he gave a lecture talking about the fact that the scientists don't talk to the humanists and vice versa. I think that's a soluble problem. I think we're all in the same boat. I think that life is all about empiricism. The only way we can transit from the explicate to the implicate order in Bohm's terms is through empiricism. So whether it's me in the laboratory doing hard science, or me hitting a shot to my tennis opponent and then asking him whether they know that shot, or whether it's forming a sentence, subject, verb, object. It actually, Wittgenstein talks about that. He says, you're constraining the verb in the sentence. The verb is the energy. You're constraining it with materialism. So to see everything we do in those terms, to be free and open and able to address who we are and what we are in the condition we are, I think is tantamount to, being human. And I think that that's where the commonality between those PhDs are, a way in which to come to provide a lens through which to see everything in a common way, not as a kaleidoscopic kind of thing. And, the contemporary postmodern thinkers are very nihilistic. I don't think that that's necessary. I think it's kind of a conceit and sophistry, whereas I think that there really is an answer to the conundrum. So, so I'm going to talk about that. And there's this thing called the Club of Remy, which fashions itself after the, there have been several roundtables over the, the last century where they talk about Club of Rome is one example.
Sure.
The Vienna Circle is another. So this is There are unfortunately a bunch of people that are older even than me. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about that idea about cybernetics, not in the sense of, you know, the classic Norbert Wiener thing, you know, the thermostat on the wall. No, I'm going to talk about the deep dive. So there, we usually think in synchronic terms, real-time space-time. The diachronic it's how I've gotten to understand evolution, for example, or even the periodic table of elements was a gift from Mendeleev, because if I had a close friend at UCLA, Eric Sherry, who is the world's expert on the periodic table. You know, why is that algorithm predictive? Well, the reason it's predictive is because every element is both synchronic and diachronic. It's both the chemical, physical characteristics of that element, and also the number of protons in the nucleus.
Sure.
So when you regress, if it were a Cartesian coordinate, if you regress the synchronic against the diachronic, those are qubits. That's the entry level for quantum mechanical computing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people are thinking about it that way. You know, when you had Joe John McFadden on, you know, it's wonderful thinking, and you know, he's got a whole lab and people in his lab dealing with this, but it's very ad hoc. It's not really drilling down to what that really means. Yeah. What quantum mechanical thought in how quantum mechanics really brings us into an age of holism and a way in which to actually in a efficient and productive way to move forward as a species, as opposed to all of these, you know, this Tower of Babel, you know, everybody talking a different language, not understanding one another. You know, these are huge problems that we have to broach, because otherwise we're just going, well, I mean, I suppose there are things on the horizon like, you know, mining asteroids that might free us for a while, but it really doesn't get at the core issues of why it is we're the only species that's destroying the planet and ourselves in the process. You have to wonder about that. Yeah. So those are a couple of things, and I've been asked to write a book on essentially on biophysics and quantum mechanics, and I have the beginnings of that. But again, you know, it was very kind of you to have me come on and talk about this stuff. But there are very few people who understand that we're in a box. You know, if you don't understand we're in a box, you can't think out of it. Yeah. That's a big problem.
Huge problem.
Yeah. Huge problem. Yeah. So I'm trying to, in my own way, you know, make people aware of the fact that we're at an inflection point. I mean, you can think of COVID as a heads up to humanity that we're, you know, and we all recognize the problem. The question is, how are we going to address it? Is it going to be a paradigm shift? Or is it just going to be like, you know, you learn a language, you learn French because you're going to Paris, you get in the taxi cab, the cab driver says, you know, in French, asks you where you're going, you tell him, and he says, je ne sais pas, you know, I don't understand. And you say it louder. That's not good, right? So, yeah. So, okay.
Good, excellent analogy.
Don't we tend to do that?
Well, John, you know, as I said, I'm pleased that you're pleased to come on at the same time. You know, this is extremely crucial area that I want to put more attention on, and the fact that you can bring this, I use this word too much, but this holistic sort of ecosystem-based approach to thinking, as I said, from the cosmos to the quantum, and understanding that this little niche that we've all been focusing in is a very small part of really everything that's going on, and we need to look at the big picture to address some of these problems, whether it's disease, whether it's food supply, whether it's the environment. But you know, I want to thank you for doing what you do to make us smarter and to get us thinking along these lines in the areas that you've spent so much time researching and writing about. And I encourage everybody listening and watching this to go out to Google and Google John Torday, and not just his books on Amazon, but go to PubMed and some of the other search engines to go through his hundreds of publications, because he really is an extremely well published author on a wide range of topics. So For everybody, once again, that's going to be listening or watching, you've been listening to Dr. John Torday, investigator at the Lundquist Institute of Biomedical Innovation. You can also find him professor of Pediatrics and Obstetrics and Gynecology and faculty of Evolutionary Medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He's also director of the Perinatal Research Training Program, the Guenther Laboratory for Cell Molecular Biology, and on the faculty division of Neonatology at the Harbor-UCLA Medical Center. He's all over the place, but doing a lot of amazing things and really using an amazing background, an amazing brain to help, as we say, craft a better tomorrow for all of us. John, thanks for taking the time out of schedule to talk to us for a little while today.
You're very welcome, and thank you. And keep on keeping on. Yeah, you're doing good work.
We're trying.
I know. Okay.